Hey there, sleepless rabble. Still scrolling at 3 a.m.? Of course you are. Don't worry, I've got something better than doom scrolling. Let me take over for a while. Tonight's story isn't about haunted castles or demons under your bed. It's about something far scarier. People. Ordinary people. With phones. Allegedly streaming the worst thing you can imagine, while others just sat and watched. Because apparently, that's entertainment now. So buckle up. This one's dark, messy, and dripping with rumors. Exactly the kind of bedtime story you didn't know you wanted. But before we start, hit subscribe, tap like, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? I want to know which corner of the world is staying awake with me. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to The Instagram Murders. 45 people watched and did nothing. Let's begin. Picture this. Just a backyard in Florencio Varela, a suburb south of Buenos Aires. Plastic chairs, a rusty barbecue pit, and a patch of grass so unremarkable it should have been invisible. Ordinary places are the cruelest, because when horror breaks out there, it feels like the universe is mocking you. The neighbors first noticed a smell. Not the kind you politely ignore like a neighbor's burnt steak, but the kind that makes your stomach curl before your brain can even name it. Heavy, sweet in the worst way, carrying on the breeze until it clung to curtains and made people mutter excuses. Maybe the drains, maybe a dead animal, maybe garbage no one collected. In reality, the smell of death is unforgettable. And yet, humans are experts at denial. It took days before someone finally picked up the phone. When the police arrived, they didn't come for a barbecue inspection. They came with tape and shovels, and that kind of grim efficiency that tells you they already had an idea of what they'd find. Officers marked off the garden while curious neighbors gathered behind gates, whispering to each other, daring not to say the word that was already in their heads. Cameras clicked as the first shovelful of earth was lifted. The ground was reluctant but not strong enough to keep it secret. The spades hit resistance, the kind that isn't stone, isn't root, but something softer, worse. Even the police fell quiet. And then came the moment no neighbor will ever forget. Pale flesh emerging from the dirt. The illusion of suburbia cracked in an instant. By the time they stopped digging, 3 bodies had been uncovered. Not strangers with no names, not statistics, but young women everyone had seen smiling from photos stuck on lampposts only days before. They had been missing for less than a week. Families had been handing out flyers, clinging to hope, whispering the desperate excuses parents make when the silence gets too long. Maybe the phone died. Maybe she stayed at a friend's. Maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. Their names would soon be repeated everywhere. Brenda del Castillo, 20. Morena Veri, 20. And Lara Gutierrez, just 15. Cousins and friends, practically still girls. Their faces were the ones neighbors had scrolled past on social media, shared with captions like, "Help us find them." Now, instead of hope, the same faces appeared on breaking news tickers, paired with words no family ever wants to see. Imagine standing at your gate while officers pull young women out of the ground next door. Yesterday you watered your plants. Today you're wondering if you should burn them. Children were dragged away from windows. Adults clutched their phones like shields. Some filmed because that's what people do now, even when their hands are shaking. The house itself didn't look like the kind of place that could host a nightmare. Faded paint, mismatched curtains, weeds growing between tiles. But monsters don't live in castles anymore. They rent modest, single-story homes with cheap furniture. It was the banality that made it unbearable. This wasn't a horror film set in a distant, exotic ruin. It was a neighbor's garden, right in suburbia, with corpses under the soil and barbecue smoke still clinging to the walls. The discovery traveled fast. Within hours, reporters had arrived, their vans parked like vultures with satellite dishes. Journalists shoved microphones at tear-streaked faces, asking mothers to comment on what no mother can comment on. Cameras panned over the lawn chairs as if zooming in could answer why 3 young women were in the ground beneath them. For Argentina, the shock cut deep. This wasn't just crime, it was performance. To bury 3 women together in one shallow grave wasn't just murder. It was a message. And though nobody knew yet what that message was, rumors began to swell like smoke from the pit. Neighbors whispered that they'd noticed strange cars outside the house, men with tinted windows, visitors at odd hours. Some swore they'd smelled something days earlier, but hindsight is always brave when danger has already passed. Nobody had called until the stench became undeniable. Denial is easy, responsibility is not. By evening, the garden was a stage of horror. Police tape flapped in the winter wind. Stray dogs circled and were chased off. Flowers appeared on the gate before anyone organized a vigil. The street learned the kind of silence that only comes when reality rips a hole too big to stitch up. And under all of it, one thought refused to go away. This wasn't just a discovery. It was the beginning of something larger, darker, and far harder to bury. Before the garden gave up its secret, there had been days of silence that stretched like elastic, snapping tighter with each unanswered call. Disappearances always begin the same way, with excuses. The first missed message is shrugged off. The second gets a question mark. By the third, the air feels heavy. Parents pace, friends scroll endlessly through chat histories, looking for some overlooked clue in emojis or typos. Nobody wants to say the word missing not yet. For the families of Brenda, Morena, and Lara, the shift from ordinary to nightmare happened almost invisibly. One evening they were laughing in selfies, the next their phones rang into nothing, a text left on read, a profile picture that didn't change. In Argentina, people know too well how fragile the line is between routine and tragedy. The country carries a history of disappearances like a scar that never quite heals. At first, there were whispers of hope. Maybe they ran away. Maybe they went to a party and forgot to tell anyone. Teenagers do reckless things, don't they? But the families knew. Mothers always. No. Hope is a stubborn thing, but when silence grows louder than excuses, the stomach knows the truth long before the mind will admit it. The search began the way they always do now, with social media. WhatsApp chains spread like wildfire. Photos of the girls accompanied by pleas written in block capitals. Help us find them. Friends reposted, strangers forwarded. Entire neighborhoods were suddenly in the loop. Local radio mentioned their names. Small papers ran soft focus stories with lines like, "Last seen wearing jeans and a hoodie." Each description was a lifeline. Fragile but necessary. Meanwhile, the families traced every step backwards. Who had they last spoken to? Where had they planned to go? Which messages didn't quite add up? Allegedly, there had been a party, the word repeated like a curse. An invitation that sounded casual but was threaded with urgency. Quick money, easy fun, bring a friend. It was the kind of pitch that's designed to disarm suspicion. No threats, no demands, just opportunity. On the night they left, phones were fully charged. Hair was done, selfies taken. Lara, the youngest, had promised to text her cousin later. "We're here," she typed, the last message her family would ever see. That small sentence became an artifact, replayed over and over, a digital relic of a life about to end. When morning came and no one returned, worry turned to action. Families reported the girls missing. Police responded with their usual glacial pace, more paperwork than urgency. Missing girls are too often treated as paperwork until bodies turn up. It's a pattern, and everyone knows it, but admitting it out loud is like spitting in the wind. Neighbors joined in the search. Some swore they had seen the girls near a station, others thought they'd spotted them in shops that didn't even have cameras. False leads multiplied. The map of Buenos Aires filling with pins that meant nothing. That's the cruelty of hope. It sends you running in circles while the truth sits still, waiting in silence. The hours between disappearance and discovery are the cruelest of all. Families imagine too much. They picture buses missed, phones stolen, arguments resolved with a sheepish return home. They bargain with God, with strangers, with the algorithm itself. If a post reaches enough screens, maybe the girls will come back. If enough people pray, maybe the door will open. But doors stayed closed, and the silence grew. The house in Florencio Varela sat quiet, its curtains drawn, its garden hiding what nobody wanted to imagine. Every unanswered call piled up like bricks on the family's chests. Even denial has limits. And by the second night, hope was already cracking under its own weight. When the word disappeared finally slipped into conversations, it was already the truth. It just hadn't been acknowledged yet. The garden had not spoken, but everyone could feel the weight of its silence. That was the cruel rhythm. 3 girls had walked into the night with casual optimism, hair brushed, phones ready, messages sent, and never walked back. Between the last text and the first shovel in the garden, there was a void, a blank stretch of hours that nobody could explain. A void that would never be filled. And when that void was finally broken by spades and soil, the world moved brutally fast. Hope evaporated. Posters became memorials, and 3 names shifted from present tense to past. When the police finally confirmed the identities, there was no relief, no neat sense of closure, just collapse. A morgue report may sound clinical, but every official word slices deeper than the rumor it replaces. Yes, it's them. Yes, we're sure. Yes, they're gone. 3 short confirmations, each one an execution of hope. For Brenda, Morena, and Lara, the world now had one single word for them. Victims. Not daughters, not cousins, not friends who laughed over cheap pizza and argued about borrowed clothes. Victims. That was the category stamped on forms, whispered into microphones, scrawled across headlines. And nothing strips a person of their humanity faster than bureaucracy deciding what box to put them in. Brenda del Castillo was 20, the kind of age where everything feels possible and impossible at the same time. She was the one people described as having a stubborn streak, quick to argue, but just as quick to laugh. Morena Very, also 20, had been planning her next steps, juggling family expectations with her own plans. And Lara Gutierrez, barely 15, was still straddling the awkward line between childhood and adulthood. A teenager who should have been worrying about exams or friendships, not ending up in a shallow grave. Together they were a trio, family, friends, inseparable threads in each other's lives. For their families, the confirmation was devastation dressed up as procedure. Mothers fainted on pavements. Fathers begged reporters to put down their cameras. Cousins stood blank-eyed outside the house that had become a tomb. Every photograph replayed in the news was one the families already knew by heart, but now it was a weapon. Every smiling face plastered on screens became another reminder of the brutal shift from missing to dead. The neighborhood absorbed it all with morbid curiosity. Some swore they'd noticed the smell earlier, others claimed to have seen strange visitors, but hindsight always makes prophets out of cowards. And while neighbors whispered, the media roared. Satellite trucks lined the street, cameras craned over gates, journalists narrated in solemn voices, as though solemnity could make the circus dignified. The coffins came quickly. Argentina has buried too many daughters to waste time. Black clothes, white flowers, the silence of grief broken only by sobs, and the intrusive click of camera shutters. The funerals looked like something out of a film nobody would willingly watch. Mothers leaning against relatives just to stay upright. Fathers shouting at journalists to back away. Entire families hollowed out in front of strangers with microphones. And still, the headlines kept coming. Triple femicide in Florencio Varela. 3 women buried in backyard. Another case of violence against women. The names of Brenda, Morena, and Lara were repeated so often that they risk becoming symbols rather than people. Argentina has seen this before. Individuals flattened into statistics, their real lives eclipsed by the story society decides to tell. But for their families, these weren't slogans. They were girls whose bedrooms still smelled like them, whose clothes still hung in closets waiting to be worn. Outside the morgue, candles flickered in plastic cups, flowers wilted in the winter air, handwritten notes curled at the edges, ordinary gestures, clumsy but defiant. Every petal, every flame was an insistence that these girls would not vanish again, not from memory, not from history. Inside the morgue, the reports were still being written. Cold words, detached and precise, reducing screams to contusions and broken bones to fractures. But language cannot blunt reality. Families don't translate cranial trauma into paperwork. They translate it into rage. The autopsies were supposed to provide answers. Instead, they added questions. By now, the case was no longer just a local tragedy. It was national, international even. A story too shocking to be ignored. And in every retelling, the same detail made the air heavier. The 3 were found together. That was the image that stuck, because it carried a meaning beyond cruelty. It was a statement, a performance, a message someone wanted delivered in the most brutal way possible. As the earth closed again over their graves, it was clear. This story was not ending at the cemetery. It was only beginning. The moment the bodies were lifted from the ground, whispers began to mutate into something far darker than the stench of the garden. Murder is one thing. Murder as performance is another. Argentina had seen violence before, but this time the horror carried an extra, almost theatrical rumor that what happened to Brenda, Morena, and Lara hadn't just been done, it had been watched. The number spread first. 45. Not 44, not 50. 45 silent spectators, allegedly present in a private Instagram room. The idea was grotesque. That while the girls suffered, nearly 4 dozen strangers sat glued to their screens. Some frozen, others allegedly typing encouragement as if it were some twisted reality show. The word allegedly did heavy lifting. Everyone repeated it. Nobody could prove it. But once the idea existed, it stuck. Screenshots appeared in chat groups, pixelated images, blurred figures, shadows that could have been anything. Some swore they saw the girls in those frames. Others dismissed them as fakes. But truth has never been the internet's favorite currency. What spreads is what shocks. And nothing shocked like the thought of a live stream torture session hiding in Instagram's digital corners. Meta, of course, denied everything. No evidence, the company insisted. No streams, no servers, nothing in their logs. On paper, the case was closed before it even began. But no evidence tastes different depending on who says it. Coming from a mother, it's relief. Coming from a billion-dollar corporation, it sounds like liability management. People weren't buying it. Journalists chased leads into dead ends. Allegedly, fragments of the video existed. Allegedly, police had seen a clip. Allegedly, WhatsApp groups traded cursed files that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The rumors multiplied like mold in the dark. Impossible to kill, feeding on the damp silence of official statements. For the families, each headline about the alleged live stream was another knife. It wasn't enough to lose their daughters. Now they had to endure the thought of strangers consuming their final moments like entertainment. Every unverified screenshot became salt in the wound. Every whispered account of, "I saw it, but I can't show it," forced them to picture what they couldn't bear to imagine. And yet, the world couldn't look away. The alleged livestream transformed a local femicide into an international headline. Instagram murders, streaming death. Horror became exportable once Wi-Fi was involved. Outlets that rarely covered violence in Argentina suddenly ran stories, not because of the victims, but because the angle clicked. Murder plus social media equals outrage that sells. Neighbors, meanwhile, were caught between disbelief and terror. Some swore they'd heard strange noises at night. Not music, not laughter, but something off. Something they remembered only once the rumors gave them permission to. Others said they saw cars parked outside, men slipping in and out. Hindsight is a convenient prophet. Courage always comes after the danger leaves. But courage wasn't the point anymore. Spectacle was. The mere idea that 45 people could sit and watch turned the crime into something bigger than itself. Murder is intimate, a transaction of cruelty between perpetrator and victim. But a broadcast? That makes it communal. It drags society into the mud, forcing everyone to ask, if 45 really did watch, what would we have done in their place? The police tried to maintain composure. "We're investigating," they said. "Remain calm." As if calm was still an option when parents were screaming their daughters' names in front of cameras. Social media, of course, did the opposite of calm. Hashtags exploded, protests reignited, and the number 45 became a ghost statistic. Repeated so often it sounded like gospel. In bars, in schools, on buses, people argued about whether the livestream was real. Some insisted they knew someone who had seen it. Others scoffed and called it hysteria. But that's the cruel genius of rumors. Even when they're false, they feel truer than truth. And this one had everything a rumor needs to thrive. Technology, voyeurism, and a crime so brutal that the ordinary explanation never seemed big enough. By the time the first vigils were held, the story was already mutating into legend. 3 girls buried in a backyard was tragic enough, but 3 girls tortured and killed on livestream while 45 people watched in silence? That was horror made for the digital age. And once a story like that gets online, good luck killing it. Servers can be wiped, accounts deleted, but the whisper never leaves. The morgue is where denial finally runs out of space. No flowers, no candles, no vigils, just stainless steel, white tiles, and the hum of refrigerators holding answers nobody really wants. When the bodies of Brenda, Morena, and Lara arrived, The whispers of the street were forced into confrontation with the language of forensics, and that language is always cruel in its neatness. The reports confirmed the obvious. They hadn't died gently. Official phrases described trauma, contusions, asphyxiation, clinical words that drain the horror from what they actually mean. Cranial trauma is a head smashed. Contusions are fists landing again and again. Asphyxiation is the panic of lungs denied air. Bureaucratic syllables masking the violence, turning screams into paperwork. Families don't hear jargon. They translate it into nightmares. But the official reports only told part of the story. The rest seeped out in leaks and rumors, filling the gaps with images worse than the truth. Allegedly, the girls had been restrained. Marks on wrists and ankles suggested ropes or cables. Allegedly, they had been beaten. The kind of blunt force wounds that speak of time and repetition, not quick endings. Some whispers went further. Cigarette burns, broken fingers, bruises in deliberate patterns. Cruelty designed not just to kill, but to perform. Performance. That word echoed through every rumor. Torture, if true, wasn't just punishment. It was theatre. If the livestream whispers held even a fraction of truth, then these acts were calculated not only to hurt, but to horrify. Every blow, every scream, allegedly captured for an unseen audience. Violence turned into spectacle, cruelty as content. Forensic contradictions didn't help. One report implied the deaths were quick. Another suggested prolonged suffering. Time of death placed them roughly within the same night they vanished. But details blurred into contradictions as if the truth itself were being scrubbed. Inconsistencies are not unusual in messy investigations. But in Argentina, where corruption is as familiar as coffee, blurred details look less like incompetence and more like erasure. The families were forced to sit across from officials who read these reports in monotone. Try to imagine it. A mother being told her daughter had multiple fractures, as if that phrasing could soften what it really meant. Fathers hearing about ligature marks without anyone daring to say the word tied. Cousins staring at diagrams of bodies reduced to outlines and measurements. Grief doesn't fit into bullet points, but that's how the state delivers it. And then there was the contradiction between silence and gossip. Police refused to confirm details, citing ongoing investigations. Journalists, on the other hand, thrived on leaks. Anonymous sources describing brutality too specific to ignore, too uncertain to verify. The result was a stew of horror, where no one knew which part was true, and yet everyone believed the worst. Because once your daughters are pulled from a shallow grave, you don't assume mercy. The word torture floated around before any authority dared to speak it. It was whispered in neighborhoods, screamed in protests, and hinted at in reports that stopped short of confirmation. Torture turns murder into something heavier, something that lingers. It's not just about ending lives, it's about making sure the victims suffer in a way that echoes. And if the livestream rumor was even partially real, then the cruelty wasn't hidden. It was broadcast, consumed, turned into digital folklore. The paradox was unbearable. Families needed answers, but every answer made the wound deeper. Each leaked detail meant imagining what had been done. Each denial meant suspecting a cover-up. Closure was impossible. Mourning was constantly interrupted by whispers of broken bones and blurred screenshots. What was certain, though, was this. These 3 young women weren't just killed. They were punished. Whatever the reason, debt, vengeance, cruelty for its own sake, the violence was methodical. The bodies themselves told the story. They spoke louder than any suspect, louder than any rumor. And yet, even the body's testimony wasn't enough. Because as brutal as the autopsies sounded, the question remained. Had this horror also been staged for an audience? Were the injuries not only inflicted but performed? That possibility was worse than any report. Murder is tragedy. Torture is cruelty. But torture broadcast to silent spectators. That is society looking at its own reflection and not liking what it sees. Murder is horror enough on its own. But the idea that it was staged like a performance, possibly streamed to dozens of silent spectators, turned this crime into something larger than a tragedy. It became theatre. Not the kind with curtains and tickets, but the kind where the stage is a screen and the audience pays not with money, but with silence. The number 45 haunted the case like a curse. 45 viewers allegedly logged into a private Instagram group. Not to report, not to scream, not to intervene, just to watch. Maybe to type. Maybe even to cheer. Nobody knows if that number was real, but once it existed, it was immortal. People repeated it in protests. Journalists printed it. Teenagers made memes out of it. 45 became the ghost at the center of the crime, the faceless crowd who did nothing. And that's what cuts so deep. Murder is intimate usually. A victim, a killer, maybe a witness or two. But the alleged livestream broke that intimacy wide open. It dragged strangers into the circle, turned cruelty into something communal. If true, the pain of Brenda, Morena, and Lara wasn't only suffered, it was consumed. Someone scrolled, someone stared, someone clicked away to another app before bed. Even without proof, the story spread because it felt possible. Too possible. We live in an age where suffering is content and tragedy trends before the bodies are even cold. It doesn't take much. Imagination to picture bored strangers stumbling into a live stream and not clicking out. Watching from curiosity or horror, or simply because the algorithm put it in front of them. Doing nothing. Because a screen makes reality feel distant enough to be safe. Meta's denials rang hollow. The company insisted no such stream existed, no data was found, no servers held anything. But people have long memories of deleted posts, vanished evidence, inconvenient files buried under legalese. No evidence from a tech giant doesn't sound like truth. It sounds like corporate triage. Journalists leaned in. International outlets picked up the case precisely because of the livestream angle. Argentina suffers femicides regularly, brutal, countless, ignored by much of the outside world. But put the word Instagram in the headline, and suddenly it sells. The Instagram murders. Death streamed online. Horror goes global when Wi-Fi is involved. For the families, the spectacle was unbearable. It wasn't enough that their daughters had been murdered. Now their deaths were stories to be debated, rumors to be dissected. Imagine mourning while strangers in another hemisphere argue on forums about whether your child's final moments were filmed. Imagine people whispering about screenshots, reacting to blurred clips, building theories out of pixels while you're still burying coffins. And yet, the spectacle refused to die. The idea of the livestream became inseparable from the crime, whether or not it had happened. Because in a way, it didn't matter anymore. The rumor was enough. Society had already absorbed it, and once absorbed, it reshaped how everyone understood the murders. The protests grew louder, fueled by the imagery. Placards carried the number 45 in bold paint. People shouted not only about femicide, but about voyeurism, about complicity, about how society had turned into an audience that never acts. Even if the livestream was a myth, It felt like a truth too real to ignore. Because isn't that what we do now? Scroll past tragedy. Watch, but don't intervene. Comment, but don't change. That was the unbearable mirror this case held up. It wasn't only about 3 murdered girls. It was about the way we consume horror. About how suffering is turned into content, and how silence becomes participation. Even if Meta was right, even if no one ever pressed the go live button, the story had already cemented itself as the nightmare of our time. That violence doesn't just happen anymore. It's performed. And if violence is performance, then who are we? Audience always audience. Argentina is no stranger to grief. The country has marched too many times, carried too many photographs of daughters who never came home. But the discovery in Florencio Varela, 3 young women buried in a garden, wrapped in rumors of torture and live streams, hit like a lightning strike. It wasn't just another femicide. It was a spectacle that forced even the most cynical hearts onto the streets. The vigils began within hours. Flowers piled up on the fence of the house, taped photos fluttered in the cold air, candles burned down to puddles of wax on the pavement. Ordinary neighbors who had whispered behind curtains now stood shoulder to shoulder, united in grief and shame. Some carried handwritten signs with the girls' names. Others simply stood in silence, because sometimes silence screams louder than words. But grief rarely stays still in Argentina. It moves, it multiplies, it becomes anger. The chant of Ni una menos, not one more, resurfaced overnight. A slogan that had been painted, shouted, and worn thin by repetition now came back with raw energy, tearing through the streets like thunder. Buenos Aires filled with voices, not just mourning Brenda, Morena, and Lara, but all the women whose names had sunk quietly into statistics. The protests were as much ritual as resistance. Candles at night, megaphones by day, mothers speaking for daughters who could no longer speak, students holding placards with shaky handwriting, the ink smudged by tears and rain, activists demanding change from a system that had failed them again and again. And behind it all, the image of those 3 graves in a backyard, reminding everyone how fragile ordinary life really is. Politicians, of course, smelled opportunity. Ministers and senators appeared at vigils with solemn faces, delivering speeches about justice and reform. They spoke of ending the culture of violence, of taking femicide seriously. The same words they had used after the last murder, and the one before that, and the dozens before those. If words were action, Argentina would already be safe. But the crowd didn't buy it. They booed, they shouted. They reminded the officials that promises mean nothing when coffins keep piling up. Some protesters went further, accusing the very authorities holding microphones of complicity. Allegedly, certain police officers knew more than they admitted. Allegedly, money had exchanged hands to keep some networks invisible. Allegedly, the silence of officials wasn't ignorance, it was convenience. These accusations weren't whispered. They were shouted into megaphones, painted on banners, written across walls. Rage makes people fearless. Meanwhile, the media feasted. Drones hovered over crowds. Cameras zoomed in on tear-streaked faces. Anchors described the marches in tones dripping with solemnity. Outrage makes excellent television. Every candle was a shot, every chant a soundbite, every confrontation with riot police a ratings boost. But beneath the spectacle, the core was raw. People were tired of burying their daughters. For the families of Brenda, Morena, and Lara, the marches were both comfort and cruelty. Comfort, because thousands carried their grief, refusing to let it shrink into private sorrow. Cruelty, because the crowds reminded them that their girls were gone. their photographs now part of a wider movement. It is unbearable to see your child turned into a symbol, but it is also unbearable to see her forgotten. The chants rolled across plazas, echoing off marble government buildings, reverberating through narrow streets, ni una menos, not one more. But everyone knew there would be more. That was the bitter truth behind the fire of the protests. People shouted not because they believed change would come instantly, but because silence was even worse. When night fell, the candles returned, flames trembling in plastic cups, smoke curling into the winter air. The vigils looked beautiful, almost cinematic, but the beauty was a weapon, a reminder that grief doesn't need to hide. Families held photos above their heads like shields, daring anyone to look away. Argentina had turned tragedy into movement before, but this time, the rumor of a live streaming gave the anger a sharper edge. Because it wasn't just about violence anymore, it was about voyeurism. About a society that seemed willing to watch, but not act. Protesters held up signs with the number 45 in bold paint, turning the faceless audience of the rumor into a symbol of everything wrong. Silence, complicity, apathy. And so the streets thundered, louder than the speeches of politicians, louder than the denials of corporations. 3 young women had been erased, but in their absence, thousands refused to let the story vanish. Their names were shouted into the night until they felt immortal. When violence in Argentina looks too theatrical, too cruel to be random, there is always a convenient explanation waiting in the wings. Narcos. Whisper that word, and suddenly everything makes sense. Or at least it sounds too dangerous to question further. That's exactly what happened with Brenda, Morena, and Lara. The narrative shifted almost overnight from tragedy to narco warning. According to rumors, the 3 girls weren't simply murdered, they were made into a message. Someone, somewhere, had stolen merchandise. Someone had failed to pay. And someone high enough in the criminal food chain decided that 3 young women would be the perfect example of what happens when you cross the line. Violence here wasn't just punishment, it was branding. Neighbors remembered expensive cars with tinted windows pulling up outside the house. Men who didn't belong in the sleepy street, who walked with the kind of swagger that says, "We don't need to hide." They came and went without fear, because fear was their camouflage. Nobody called the police until the garden began to stink. By then, courage was useless. The theory spread fast. Allegedly, the girls themselves weren't even connected to drugs. They were lured as bait, punished for the sins of others. Allegedly, the order came down cold and casual, like signing off on a grocery list. In the warped logic of cartel violence, their deaths weren't just executions. They were a press release. Because narco logic has its own rhythm. Murder isn't just elimination, it's theatre. Each body is a billboard, each burial a headline. And if the live stream rumors carried even a shred of truth, then this wasn't only punishment, it was advertising. A demonstration of reach, of power, of cruelty amplified by Wi-Fi. Kill to scare. Broadcast to dominate. The police, predictably, leaned into this explanation. It was easier to blame an invisible cartel than to admit how badly the state had failed. Easier to say gang-related than to answer why 3 young women could vanish, be tortured, possibly streamed online and buried in a backyard without anyone stopping it. Calling it narco-violence shifted blame away from police, away from institutions, and into the shadows where accountability can't follow. But Argentines weren't convinced. Not this time. Because even if the narco angle was true, the spectacle revealed something deeper. A brittle system that lets young women be erased and only rediscovered when the killers get sloppy. People knew the difference between an explanation and an excuse, and Narcos Did It sounded far too much like the latter. International media, meanwhile, latched onto the theory like vultures. Cartel livestream murder. Narco femicide. Headlines practically wrote themselves. For reporters abroad, it was a perfect cocktail. Latin America, drugs, violence, Instagram. The truth mattered less than the aesthetic. And somewhere, if the theory was real, the people who gave the order were probably smiling. Their message had travelled farther than any shipment of cocaine ever could. The whispers about a mastermind made things worse. A shadowy figure allegedly at the top, untouchable, issuing commands while pawns carried shovels. Some said he was a local boss. Others swore he was foreign. Peru, Paraguay, maybe higher still. His name was never printed, only hinted. The press loved the mystery. The police loved the distraction, and the families hated it. Because every time the mastermind was mentioned, justice felt further away. It didn't matter if the mastermind was real or a convenient phantom. The damage was the same. 3 women were dead, and the story was spiraling into myth. Each retelling pushed the focus away from the girls themselves and deeper into shadowy networks nobody could see. Narco violence has always thrived on spectacle. Kill not only to punish, but to remind. To show that innocence is irrelevant. Safety an illusion. And in September, Brenda, Marina, and Lara became unwilling actors in a performance that Argentina couldn't stop watching. Every neighborhood has that one house, the one people glance at without meaning to, the one kids dare each other to touch before running off squealing, the one where silence feels heavier than sound. In Florencio Varela, that house wasn't folklore anymore. It was real, a single-story home with peeling paint, mismatched curtains, and a garden that gave up 3 bodies. At first glance, it looked like nothing. A tired facade, tiles cracked from years of rain, weeds pushing through the gate. If you'd walked past a week earlier, you wouldn't have slowed down. Maybe you'd assume a family lived there quietly. Someone's uncle minding his business. But once the soil opened, the house became infamous overnight. Police swarmed the property, stretching yellow tape around it like a crude frame for the horror inside. Forensic vans parked out front, reporters filmed through the bars, and neighbors stared as if the house itself had betrayed them. You could almost hear the shame in their voices. We lived next door to this and said nothing. Investigators found traces, though the official reports contradicted each other so often it felt like a cover-up. Allegedly, there were ropes. Allegedly, bottles, stains, fingerprints in places fingerprints shouldn't be. Days later, items logged in one document disappeared from another. Argentina has a long history of lost evidence. Envelopes that vanish, files that burn, cameras that mysteriously stop working. This case fit the pattern a little too well. Then came the digital trail. Phones that should have been treasure troves were mysteriously wiped. Some vanished completely. Others showed fragments of conversations, the party invitations, the last "we're here" text, sudden silences where replies should have been. Rumors claimed investigators had found a video fragment on one seized device, dimly lit, a voice shouting orders, a sob in the background. Police denied it instantly, of course, but once a rumor like that escapes, denial is useless. People believe because they want to, or because they fear it's true. The neighbors filled the gaps with memory. Strange cars parked at odd hours, men with unfamiliar faces, voices carrying at night that weren't laughter, and weren't music either. Courage is always retrospective. Nobody picked up the phone until the smell made it impossible not to. And yet, days later, everyone suddenly remembered details as if they'd been collecting them all along. The house itself became cursed. Parents told their children to cross the street rather than walk past. Teenagers dared each other to touch the gate, laughing nervously, then bolting as if chased. Some swore the windows looked darker than others, that the walls carried a heaviness you could feel in your chest. Superstition fills silence where facts are missing, and this house offered endless silence. Journalists returned again and again to film what was essentially nothing, just a locked door and a patched lawn. But the nothingness was the point. Horror doesn't need gothic castles or shadowy forests. Sometimes it's a concrete garden in suburbia, hiding death under mosquito spray and plastic lawn chairs. The ordinariness was the scariest part. For the families, the house was unbearable. They came to lay flowers on the fence, to tape photos to the rusted wire, to burn candles until the wax pooled on the pavement. Every vigil turned the street into a shrine, transforming the quiet facade into a monument to cowardice and silence. Houses have memories, and this one carried a burden it would never shake. The police treated the property like a crime scene, but not for long. Eventually the vans left, the tape sagged in the wind, and the house stood abandoned, empty and accusatory. What had once blended into the neighborhood now glared at everyone who walked by. It was no longer a home. It was evidence. It was myth. And like all myths, it began to gather legends. Allegedly, people heard cries at night, carried on the wind. Allegedly, lights flickered when anyone lingered too close. Allegedly, the soil still seemed restless, as though disturbed by what it had been forced to hide. Were any of these real? Probably not. But legends thrive where the truth is absent. Florencio Varela moved on, at least officially. Buses still ran, shops still sold cigarettes and bread, people still hurried to work. But the street didn't move on. The house remained, a scar nobody could plaster over. Neighbors avoided it, even as journalists continued to broadcast its empty windows to the world. It stood stubbornly, daring passers-by to forget. They didn't. They won't. And in the end, that was the strangest part. The house had been ordinary for years. It only became extraordinary once it told the truth. Every nightmare eventually produces suspects. It's part of the choreography. Tragedy, outrage, then the slow march of men in handcuffs for the cameras. The case of Brenda, Morena, and Lara followed the same script. Within days of the discovery, the police had their first arrests. Headlines flashed names and blurry mugshots, as though this parade of nobodies could balance the scale of horror. The first suspects looked more like extras than villains. Small-time operators, street-level hustlers, men who fetch coffee in the hierarchy of crime, not the ones who sign death warrants. But Argentina's justice system loves the performance of progress. Dragging a few unlucky faces in front of journalists creates the illusion that something is happening, even when the real architects of violence remain untouched. Allegedly, one suspect bragged too much. He gave interviews, smirked on television, hinted at details better left unsaid. His arrogance painted a target on his back. Another suspect allegedly spilled fragments in private chats, not realizing that private and digital don't belong in the same sentence anymore. Screenshots travel faster than bullets, and soon he was in custody too. The arrests multiplied. 2 became 5, 5 became 7. Each new headline promised progress. Justice is near, officials said. standing stiff at press conferences with flags behind them. For the families, those words were addictive. Hope is hard to kill, even when it's been poisoned before. They wanted to believe justice was coming, because the alternative, that it never would, was unbearable. But the holes in the story were obvious. These men were pawns, disposable, replaceable. The kind who dig graves, not the kind who order them. If the narrative of narco vengeance was true, then the people responsible were still untouchable, sitting in gated mansions, sipping coffee while the police put on theatre for the public. Whispers about a mastermind circulated endlessly. Allegedly, a shadowy figure had given the order. Some said he was a local boss. Others swore he was foreign. Peru, Paraguay, maybe higher. His name was never printed, but everyone claimed to know someone who knew. The police leaned into the mystery, promising they were closing in, though somehow never close enough. It was a perfect phantom. Terrifying, unverifiable, and politically useful. Meanwhile, the arrested men played their roles badly. Some denied everything, others hinted at knowing more. One was too eager for the cameras, another too quiet. Together they looked less like a criminal network and more like a mismatched group of men caught in a storm too big for them. The public wasn't convinced, and neither were the families. You don't bury 3 girls in a garden just because 7 nobodies decided it was a good idea. Still, the spectacle worked. International outlets ran stories about 7 suspects arrested in Instagram murder case. The details didn't matter. The headline was enough. Progress had been made. Justice was supposedly on the way. And if you didn't look too closely, it almost sounded true. But the crack showed quickly. Evidence contradicted itself. Items logged went missing. Witness accounts shifted. Allegedly, confessions were made, then retracted. Allegedly, one suspect named names, only for the trail to vanish into silence. It was a puzzle that seemed designed never to fit together. For the families, each arrest was a cruel joke. They wanted the truth, not placeholders. They wanted the people who had ordered the violence, not the disposable men who had carried it out. But those figures remained shadows, untouchable. The case was becoming less about solving a crime and more about feeding a narrative. And narratives don't bury the dead. Justice in Argentina often looks like this. Arrests without answers, suspects without trials, investigations that circle until they collapse under their own weight. Theatre. And while the state played its part, the families buried daughters. The public shouted in the streets. And the real question lingered unanswered. Who gave the order? The handcuffs clicked shut, the cameras flashed, and still the story had no ending. Only more questions, only more silence, only the uneasy knowledge that the people who mattered most were still out there, watching the performance with a smile. True crime has an expiry date. Headlines fade, hashtags sink, and families are left alone with their grief. But sometimes, a case mutates, crawls out of the newspapers, and settles into folklore, where it never dies. That's what happened in Florencio Varela. The murders of Brenda, Morena, and Lara didn't remain a tragedy. They became a story people told at parties, on TikTok, in half-whispered conversations late at night. The details blurred, stretched, twisted, but the core stayed the same. 3 girls, a backyard grave, and an alleged livestream that nobody could prove yet everyone swore was real. Clips began to circulate, or at least things that claimed to be clips. Grainy videos of unrelated violence were repackaged as the Instagram murders. Screenshots surfaced, easily faked, but shared as gospel. Proof didn't matter. Shock did. On TikTok, users filmed themselves outside the infamous house, daring each other to touch the gate or linger at the fence. Ghost hunting channels declared the property cursed. YouTube thumbnails screamed, "Livestream murders you were never supposed to see," with neon arrows pointing at nothing. Teenagers swapped stories of friends who had allegedly seen the original stream. Whether any of it was true became irrelevant. The legend had overtaken the facts. The number 45 grew into a meme. "Don't be one of the 45s," people joked darkly online. Hashtags turned the faceless viewers into moral warnings, or punchlines depending on who was. Posting. Urban legends thrive on numbers. 37 witnesses in New York, 45 spectators in Argentina. Always precise, always unverifiable. Precision is what makes it believable. Meanwhile, reaction videos racked up views. Strangers gasped, cried, and speculated on camera as if they had been present in the garden. The tragedy of 3 murdered girls was now content. Served up in 15-second clips, dissected in live streams where the crime was retold like a campfire story. The internet doesn't ask for consent. It takes grief and rebrands it. For the families, this was another layer of torment. Imagine trying to mourn while strangers in other countries argue online about whether your daughter's final moments looked staged. Imagine seeing her name trend not for justice, but for clicks. The girls had become unwilling characters in a franchise they never chose. Even outside Argentina, the myth traveled. International podcasts picked up the case. Threads on Reddit spiraled into theories, some grounded in scraps of evidence, others pure invention. Some believed the livestream was undeniable, others insisted it was hysteria. But both sides kept talking, which was enough to keep the story alive. The house itself transformed into a landmark. People called it cursed ground. Children crossed the street to avoid it. Parents whispered warnings. Visitors filmed its facade as though capturing proof of evil, when in reality it was just concrete, paint, and a lawn that had held too much. But perception is stronger than reality. And in perception, that house was haunted forever. The girls' names, once fragile imposters, were now woven into chants, headlines, TikToks, hashtags. They had become more than themselves, unwilling saints in a narrative that wasn't about them anymore, but about everyone's need to process fear. That's the cruelty of folklore. It doesn't care about truth, it cares about survival. A live stream that may never have existed became a story people swore was real, because the idea of it felt truer than silence. And once a story enters the bloodstream of the internet, it never leaves. Closure is a polite word, the kind officials like to use when cameras are on. But there was never any closure in Florencio Varela. 3 girls were pulled from a garden. 7 suspects were paraded for the news. A phantom mastermind was invoked and never found. The case ended the way Argentina's worst tragedies often do, with grief, rumors, and silence dressed up as procedure. Yes, there were arrests. Yes, there were vigils. Yes, politicians gave speeches and swore things would change. But beneath all that choreography, the reality was brutal. The families still had coffins instead of answers. The rumors about live streams still floated through dark corners of the web. The alleged mastermind remained untouchable, a shadow that could be anyone, and therefore was no one. The truth slipped away, blurred by contradictions, police files that didn't match, evidence that vanished, reports rewritten until nobody could tell where fact ended and fiction began. Maybe there was a live stream, maybe there wasn't. Maybe someone high up gave the order. Maybe it was just local cruelty wrapped in myth. Nobody knows. Maybe nobody ever will. But does it matter anymore? In a sense, the crime has already outlived its investigation. The legend is stronger than the evidence. Ask someone in Buenos Aires today, and they won't recite autopsy reports or police statements. They'll tell you about the 45 silent witnesses. They'll tell you about the cursed house. They'll tell you the murders were streamed, even if nobody can show proof. Because in folklore, proof is optional. The families carry a different version. Their truth isn't about numbers or rumors. It's about bedrooms left untouched, clothes still hanging in closets, voices they will never hear again. While the public debates live streams and masterminds, the families live with the simpler horror. Their daughters are gone. Florencio Varela still has that house. The facade has been patched, the garden replanted, but paint and soil don't erase history. Neighbors cross the street to avoid it. Children whisper ghost stories about it. Journalists still point cameras at its silent windows. It stands as a reminder that evil doesn't need castles or dungeons. Sometimes it only needs a backyard and a little silence from everyone around it. And so the story lingers, unfinished. The internet won't let it die. TikToks, YouTube thumbnails, Reddit threads, the case is kept alive not by justice but by clicks. People still ask, did the live stream really happen? Was it all an urban legend? The question keeps the story alive, even if the answer never comes. For Argentina, the scariest part isn't just the crime, it's the reflection it forces. Because whether or not 45 people really watched, the story revealed an uncomfortable truth. Society has become an audience. We scroll, we stare, we consume. And too often, we do nothing. That is the real nightmare of Florencio Varela. Not only that 3 young women were murdered, but that their suffering has been transformed into a story without an ending. A story retold, reshaped, consumed over and over. A story louder than the crime itself, one that the internet will keep alive long after the last suspect's name has faded. No justice tied up with bows, no villains neatly dragged into the light. Just 3 names echoing through Argentina, 3 families carrying holes where daughters used to be, and a story the world refuses to bury. And maybe that's why you're still awake, listening. Because the scariest stories aren't about ghosts or monsters. They're the ones where the ending never comes. So that's where we leave it tonight. Sleepless rabble, 3 girls, a backyard grave, and a story that refuses to end. No neat justice, no clean answers, just rumors, silence, and an echo that keeps getting louder. If you stayed with me through the shadows, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and help keep these stories alive. And tonight's question for you: do you think the Instagram livestream really happened? Or is it just a legend that grew too big to die? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading. This has been Napmax Sleep Stories. And you've just listened to the Instagram murders. 45 people watched and did nothing. Now close your eyes, let the noise fade, and if you hear whispers about 45 silent witnesses, just remember, it's allegedly. Good night, sleepless rabble.